An analysis of Andrew Huberman's video strategy. I want to talk about the following points. Talking about topics with research, staying away from too controversial issues, approximating real-life speaking, speech as bottleneck constraint, and videos doubling as podcast. In the beginning, we talk about topics with research. Now, this seems to be fairly obvious. If I talk about things where I have no knowledge or experience about, then this is rather worthless. So the worth of speaking seems to be created in talking about things where I actually know something about. And similar, maybe Andrew Huberman talks about the things where he actually knows a thing or two about, which in this case is mostly neuroscience. Then he also extensively prepares these episodes, but he also now covers more and more other topics, which some scientists seem to criticize, but others seem to welcome. Now, at the end of the day, I welcome this very much, also covering different kinds of topics, because then I can also listen to these topics from the same person, basically filtering, using Andrew Huberman as a lens to view all of these different topics through. Now, I am talking, maybe I have to mention this, biased by being an Andrew Huberman consumer. I am at the other end, and I have been listening to all episodes so far, and 2 days ago, another came out, and I also listened to it. I didn't watch these episodes, and this is also an advantage which we will cover in point 5. Staying away from too controversial issues. He stays away from politics, and he also mentioned that he has a list with all the things that he just doesn't want to talk about publicly. There seems to be a rationale probably behind this. As I've been listening to another book in the last days, I've also noticed again that there are probably layers and layers and layers upon the things we do, and layers of things we might understand and things we might not understand, at least according to this book. So by staying away from too controversial issues, he just avoids them. He just avoids that he is associated with them, and therefore he seems to be fine still, even though he talks about many different topics, which also might cause otherwise disturbance if they were talked about in another way, but because they're covered by Andrew Huberman in a trying to be scientific and science-based way, they seem to not cause too much of something online. Approximating real-life speaking. If you ever have seen one of the Andrew Huberman episodes, he just wears a black shirt and he just talks straight into the camera with a black background. Now, you might also, if you're seeing this, see that I've maybe copied this, or maybe I've heard it slightly before, or maybe I'm just mentioning this in order to not give all the credit to Andrew Huberman. Let's just say I copied all of it. Why? Because it makes sense. He is reducing himself, and he said this in a few interviews, he's reducing himself to basically the minimal version of himself. And thereby, he allows you to basically see him just as the vessel the information passes through. And therefore, you don't have to, maybe you don't like earpiecings, or earpiecings, I think is the proper word, or maybe he would have, I don't know, maybe he covers up his tattoos whenever he is appearing online, because he just doesn't want to be associated with these, with basically tattoo topics or something like this. So he covers himself up with his black shirt and basically not idealizes, but he brings himself down to a version that allows you to focus on the information at hand and not on the vessel that gives you the information. So he's basically doing this in order to serve the audience. At least that seems as if it was his intent. Approximating real-life speaking is still the point I want to talk about. And Andrew Huberman could have started in a completely different way. And I actually didn't notice this very much until it came up again and again and again. And he actually talked about this in an interview. He said that he wanted to use, and this would be the next point, speech as a bottleneck constraint. This might be a different wording from my side, but he, at least in my mind, talked about this. So in evolution, there is the concept, at least that's what I was taught about in school, that if a population, let's say a given population, out of this population 10% are set to another island, for example, then, or fly away somewhere, then, so this might be a different evolutionary constraint actually, but if you take a certain set of this population and then you push them basically through a bottleneck. So let's just say, okay, there are all of the living animals on this planet, and then there is a big volcano breakout, or a giant meteorite or asteroid, I can't remember the proper one, arrives on Earth, and there is night all day, and then maybe the dinosaurs die. So this seems to be a bottleneck constraint, and maybe the mammals then survive. So basically, by pushing something through a constraint, that thing that is on the other side is kind of filtered, you could also say. So Andrew Huberman talked about this, that he wanted to use speech as a constraint, and I think he also has done a few things which he might not have talked about, but at least from my view now, that are very useful with this speech as a bottleneck constraint approach. Because speaking, compared to a visual, for example, if you see a visual and then there is a graph and then there is maybe math involved, then you might already steer away lots of people. But if it's just talking, if this conversation could happen at the gym, and then he also uses words that usually are not, that usually try to describe something in a language that everybody can understand, he makes his content more approachable by more people. And this allows basically a bigger audience. So if this is the potential Huberman audience, if he talks scientifically, and this is the potential Huberman audience, if he tries to use a little bit simpler words, then he has a bigger audience, which then allows him to scale up all of his efforts. For example, his funding Huberman Lab Premium, which he in one of the recent episodes mentioned that there seems to be, or it was maybe in the questions and answers episode, that he now is basically funding science with this Huberman Premium channel. And he also mentioned the different kinds of studies and people that were on the Huberman Lab podcast that actually got funding from Huberman. And he basically becomes a player in scientific funding through the work he is doing. And of course, you could also still, of course, critique can be applied to what he puts out, and maybe also to what other people put out, or what I put out, or what everybody puts out. And maybe critique also should be applied. But at the same time, I think it becomes more and more noticeable that he is basically having or leveraging himself with this thing that he created, which is the Huberman Lab. Videos doubling as podcast. Now, this is just kind of a side effect, you could also say, but I think, at least it seems, that it was also intended. Huberman seems to be someone who thinks about this, and he stuck to the strategy of making these videos almost exactly like in the beginning, apart from adding these interviews. Now, in a few episodes in the Journal Club with Peter Attia, he also introduced a few graphs. Peter Attia, I think, often has a few graphs which he overlays in his videos. Andrew Huberman doesn't. Usually, he doesn't have graphs in his videos because speech as a bottleneck constraint, which allows you to then also listen to the audio of his videos without having basically a degradation in listening quality or understanding quality. Understandment, you could say. Or you could say there is a reduced comprehension opportunity if I listen to a Peter Attia episode where he has graphs and then he talks about these graphs in a way that is not addressing the listeners. And by reducing yourself to speech, even if you record video, and also not having these visuals which you otherwise then would have to explain for the listeners who can see this, or for the people who listen to this on audio, what is on this, what are you showing me, or what are you giving me? He removes all of this unnecessary fluff, you could also call it, maybe not, but he basically is just removing this by putting everything through a bottleneck, and in this case speech, and also having the interviews only speech and speech and speech and speech. He's basically pushing everything through this constraint, which allows him to cover more platforms. Now, he posts onto YouTube. I don't know if he now also posts his videos as a video podcast. I haven't seen them anywhere else, but it is available. The podcast is available also as audio only, and mostly I listen to the podcast actually as a podcast. And YouTube, of course, is also there, and he has basically one of the most successful TV series ever on the planet on the topic of health, and is, I think, still ranked #1 on many different platforms. Or, yeah, platforms would be the right word, even though the platforms in terms of podcast would be something like Apple Podcasts, for example, and not something like YouTube, where there seems to be no ranking, at least in terms of podcast, or I haven't seen any. And I've viewed this over the years again and again since I began listening to Andrew Huberman. His content strategy, what you could call it content strategy, seems to be just basically delivering value. Seems to be just basically approximating what otherwise would happen in real life. If you would meet Andrew Huberman in real life and you asked him if he had 2 hours to explain this and this, then he might basically give you a 2-hour talk with all of the things he at this point in time knows. And he doesn't overlay visuals, because in real life you also would not overlay visuals. And he does not do many other things, like cutting all the time, or like introducing music, apart from the intro music that is usually played in the beginning. He doesn't have, of course he has the sponsored parts now, and also already in the beginning, and this would not happen in real life. But apart from this, he is basically approximating conversation, or maybe also teaching in real life. Maybe because he actually was a Stanford professor, or still is an associate, or an actual professor. I don't quite know about his status there. So these were the 5 points of Andrew Huberman's content strategy that maybe are not so much a content strategy, but maybe he's just using video as basically a vessel again, as he is using himself, or maybe seeing himself as a vessel for the information to pass through from him or other people through him to you.